Alrighty. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are located, and welcome to our second webinar of our adaptive planning webinar series. For those of you who are not familiar with InterCrowd, we are a full-service Workday partner, and we offer initial deployment, Phase X, and post-production support services for HCM, financials, adaptive planning, integrations, Extend, and more. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please submit those in the Q&A feature or chat, and we will take time at the end to answer those. With that, I'll pass it over to Frank to get us started.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Frank Jefferson. I am the Adaptive Practice Manager here at InterCrowd. I've spent 20 years in FP&A and financial systems. The last 12 or so, I've been in the Workday Adaptive ecosystem. I first became familiar with Adaptive as a user on the client side, part of an implementation at a firm that I worked for then, parlayed that experience into kind of a second career as an adaptive consultant, and even spent a little time with Workday as a certification instructor. I've been involved in multiple adaptive deployments, servicing over 50 clients across a dozen or so industries. We're going to go through workforce planning, how adaptive can help businesses get their head and hands around their workforce and the related expenses. I'm going to go quickly through some core concept slides so I can get right to a live workforce planning demo. And as Tia mentioned, we'll have a couple minutes at the end for some Q&A. Workforce planning is basically a way to leverage adaptive planning to organize the goals of the organization, create driver-based models so that we can analyze variances a little deeper, whether they be actuals versus prior periods or versus budgets or forecasts. It also allows for company-wide collaboration across all of your department leaders. Some of the fundamental concepts for those of you that aren't really familiar with adaptive, there are certain key components within the system that help us organize our data. Levels are the primary organizational structure of your particular firm. We use metric accounts and calculations to derive some financial budget amounts around your personnel and workforce. We can use dimensions and attributes to slice and dice that data, whether it be by department or cost center or location or function, limited only basically by your imagination. We can also create versions for comparison purposes like actuals and budgets and forecasts, what if versions. You can make tweaks to your workforce depending on possible scenarios that you may be considering. Adaptive does a very good job of managing currencies, so you can, as you'll see in the demo, if your workforce is global, we can make adjustments for consolidation purposes around currency translation. And one of the key components, of course, is time. We typically create our budgets in a time stratum of month, quarter, and year. I mentioned levels. This is important in a couple of ways. For example, it's going to determine the workflow and security, most importantly. And when it comes to personnel planning, we need to take security very seriously. This is sensitive data that not everybody should be privy to across your organization. So we can set security groups up by level and function. For example, Rachel, who is responsible in this SNP for finance and admin, perhaps Rachel is only able to see folks personnel related data within her organization. And Steve Morgan, who's at the top of the org chart here, he would be able to view and analyze headcount across his organization. Versions, as I mentioned, we can organize our data and save off snapshots, so we can have one personnel model related to our budget. We'd have one personnel model related to next quarter's forecast, for example. We can create what if scenarios and versions such that if we were considering an acquisition or a divestiture some time during, let's say, the 2026 budget period, you'd be able to analyze your data and understand what types of, what the personnel situation might look like down the road, and allow you to compare those, all those scenarios to hopefully make better decisions around your personnel and your financial budgets. Adaptive, we're going to go through some of this stuff live, but the process starts with a sheet. We will build, and I'll demonstrate a typical personnel related sheet. All the data is sort of aggregated there. There are numerous calculations that can be designed behind all this data. Once all that data is consolidated into a sheet and all those calculations are derived, we can create some reports that show, whether it be headcount or personnel related expense reports. And we can also show snapshots on a dashboard where we can show various KPIs related to our personnel data. We can also use something, the item on the left shows a process tracker that can be designed in Adaptive so that users, when they log into the system, they get a sort of an abbreviated to-do list in the left-hand margin in Adaptive that basically lists out their upcoming tasks. In this case, they've got to update a forecast, provide detailed variance explanations, add detailed buyer's comments, and these also provide hyperlinks. So if this is tied to the personnel sheet, the user can click the item in the process tracker, they'll go right to whatever component of Adaptive they need to be in to address the items in their list, which also helps senior management quickly see how far along in the process are we. We've got 3 months to build our budget. We're halfway through the 3 months, but we're 60% through the work and the tasks, so they can kind of see if we're falling behind or if we're ahead of progress on our workforce planning related items. Some of the calculations that that I'll demonstrate. Of course, we can calculate monthly salary. We can derive data around headcount and FTE and identify months in which we've got multiple hires or turnover. We can calculate taxes based on locations and respect limits like around Social Security and unemployment. We can create bonuses and medical benefit calculations along with pensions, etc. Again, whatever level of detail your organization would like to derive expenses around, we can build formulas to do so. These are also assumption, a lot of these calculations are assumption based. So this is a snip of a typical assumption sheet where we can enter rates for our various benefits. We can enter tax rates, whether they be global or statewide. We can include assumptions around attrition. If staffing is, typically if you've got folks that are scheduled to be hired in Q3, for example, if there's a delay in those hires, you might have a little bit of room in your budget. Some of our clients like to create some formulas around attrition so that your budgets are a little more accurate relative to what we know may be some gaps in a hiring plan. We can apply merits across all of our employees, and we can schedule those to take place and we can schedule those to take place in a particular month at a particular level of increase. We can also budget salaries based on month or working days. If you've got a hourly staff that might be, paid based on certain hours in a month, we can set assumptions around that as well and get particularly digital around those expenses related to folks that might not be salary employees. These are some examples of the data points that we can pull into Adaptive, and all of these data points can be analyzed and reported on. You could see that this is quite a long list, and it includes more things than just what you may kind of typically expect around personnel. This as well, like job profiles, employee IDs, bonuses, organizations, event reasons. Anything that might be in Workday in your front end system can be integrated into Adaptive and used to either derive our financial data or used in a report or a dashboard snip. This is just a quick example of some of the fields in Workday and how they translate into Adaptive. In some cases, filled positions and unfilled positions are categorized differently. This is just an example of how we can translate those from Workday into Adaptive. I mentioned security. There's a number of things we can do in Adaptive. We can create user groups to determine security, whether it be by level or by function. We can create roles and permission sets within Adaptive that will limit the level of detail folks can see. Perhaps we can see aggregated, consolidated salary expenses, but we can limit drill down capabilities to prevent certain users from seeing the detail behind those numbers. And of course, we can base it not just on levels, but soup orgs and cost centers and other attributes or dimensions, depending on the needs of your firm. This is a quick snip of how how a timeline typically goes. It takes us somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 weeks or so to roll out workforce planning deployment in Adaptive. And of course, that varies based on the level of detail and the size of your structure. The thing that I like to point out here for those folks that are familiar with a Workday deployment, one thing that is a little different about an Adaptive deployment is the model design and development typically overlaps with testing. We don't wait until everything's all built out and developed for our users to test it. We try to make sure we don't veer too far off the beaten path. We build a little, test a little, build a little, test a little, because there are typically changes that pop up along the way. In other words, folks that are not familiar with the capabilities and the types of things that we can do in Adaptive, once clients start to get a little bit of a flavor for what can be done, things typically change, and we like to kind of give some time to review and test and adjust as we go through the configuration. I'm going to bounce into a demonstration now. I'm going to go over into Adaptive. For those of you familiar, this is the landing page in Adaptive. In a workforce planning setting, we typically use a personnel sheet that in this case it's named workforce planning in our sheet list here. So what we see here is basically an employee roster. Now all these columns here are fairly typical, but they are not at all fixed or standard. Depending on the data that your organization prefers to report and analyze on, some of these columns may differ. And again, these columns are fully customizable. I don't know that we have any two clients whose workforce planning sheets are identically configured. We basically go through deep discovery determine what types of things are going to be required to meet your needs, and we design these accordingly. But there are some typical things here. For example, in addition to customizing these columns, some clients prefer to get a little more digital with things like health benefits and pension and taxes. Other companies prefer to just apply kind of an overall global fringe rate and apply, say, 25 cents on every salary dollar to cover their fringes. It really just it's completely dependent on your specific needs. Now, in this case, there are some things we can do on this sheet, some things I want to demonstrate. Let me find Jake Lee. He's right here. So Jake Lee is a CFO. He's in California. He was hired on August 1st, 2016. If I right click on Jake's row, I can go to row details and I can see the calculations being derived individually for Jake. So if we go into January of 2021 here, we can see that he counts as one headcount because he was here the entire month. His salary is $18,750 a month. He's got a 50% bonus on his row. If we look back here, you can see his bonus percent is 50 right there. And Adaptive is calculating and accruing 50% of his salary in a bonus account. Adaptive is also calculating his Social Security taxes. And in the US, we've got a limit on how much companies have to contribute for Social Security. Adaptive and the formula behind all this respects that limit. And you can see that as of June of 2021, Jake is going to reach that limit. He will get there with $944 left of expense in that month, which allows for a very accurate budget because there's no need to continue budgeting for Social Security expenses related to Jake if he's met the maximum in June of 2021. He's good at that point. We also calculate the same thing with state unemployment and these other insurance buckets that were specific to this demo. You can see that once maximums are reached, we no longer budget for that individual on those expense lines. Another thing that comes into play with Jake is you'll notice that these health benefits, there are multiple plans in this case that have been included in these analytics. Jake has opted into plan one. So Jake's benefit expense here on plan one is only $175 a month. The next example I'll show you will be someone in a different that has opted into a different plan. You'll see their expenses are going to be slightly different. Let me move down. Jennifer Carter is a good example here of something else we can do in a personnel model. Jennifer is a VP in the UK. She splits her time between two levels. She works in Sales London and she works in Birmingham. So Adaptive we've set up this particular model where 60% of her expenses are going to go to a London level and 40% of her expenses are going to go to a Birmingham level. This is completely editable. If her participation or her contribution to those levels varies by month, you can go in and make changes to this 50-50, split it 60-40 the other way, flip these around. And Adaptive is going to correctly recognize the amount of time that she's spending working in those two levels. She also has opted into plan 3 for health benefits, and she participates in this contribution plan A. So if I look at her row details and I go into 2021, we can see exactly how much of her salary is going to Sales London. We can see how much of her related expenses are going into London. Here we could see she's on plan 3, and the portion of plan 3 that's going to be expensed in this Sales London level is $120. You could see her partial headcount in this level is at 0.6. And all of these calculations are taking all of those things into consideration. She also is part of a pension plan. So if I look in here, this defined pension plan A, she's making, or the company is making contributions on her behalf to that particular pension expense line. And all of this data again is very accurate and specific based on the amount of time she spends working in sales London. This takes a lot of the mystery out of variances related to headcount. And most of our clients, your workforce is going to make up somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 or 60% of your overall financial picture. And if you can nail those line items in a budget, you're well on your way to having a very accurate budget. And when you have this level of detail behind your salary line, it's very easy to drill in and identify variances. You can see, oh, we hired this person, and I could find somebody with a mid-year hire date, I think. Here's someone right here, this new hire. I can check the row details on this person. They were hired March 16th. So if I move to March 16th of 2021, we can see that in March, this person only counted as roughly half of an FTE, and we're applying only half of those expenses to that March 2021 budget. If this person actually started April 16th, we would quickly be able to see in a variance analysis that we might have had a $5,000 variance related to this because the hire date was pushed out. There's a lot of analytical power behind setting up your workforce plan like this. Quickly, I want to go to another option that some clients use. You don't have to get that detailed. You don't have to get that digital in this hourly workforce model. This is an example of another way to budget your workforce. In this case, we've got a manager, technician, a senior technician, and we've modeled this in the aggregate. So you can see in this monthly timeline, we've got one manager, we've got 5 senior techs, we've got 4 technicians, and this is going to consolidate data in kind of an aggregated way where instead of listing out all 5 named senior techs, you just say we've got 5 of them. They average about 5% overtime. They average about $27 an hour. And again, all the calculations, we still have row details behind this, and we can see how all the math is working. And in this case, we're applying an overriding kind of a global benefit rate to all 5 of those senior technician folks. So it doesn't have to be as complicated as I showed a couple minutes ago. You can build this out in a kind of a simplified, rolled up way. Gives you a little less of a window into your variances. But again, if this is if you've got a high level of turnover, or a giant workforce like Amazon distribution center workers, you might want to name you might not want to name 20,000 individuals that may be seasonal or turn over from time to time. You can just make those assumptions in here. And if your workforce is going to be, you're going to need more of these folks in the summer, you can just go in and triple these numbers in your sheet so that now you've just made an adjustment for some seasonal workers across your personnel model here. And again, know that those expenses are going to carry through and consolidate all the way up to the top of the organization. We can also create reports and dashboards around this data. Just to give you a little bit of a snip before we move into Q&A here. If I go to this workforce KPI dashboard, this is an example of some of the types of KPIs and graphs and trends you can show related to your workforce. And again, this is fully customizable. You're not married to these graphs and charts that we've included here. Whatever makes sense when coming to analyze your business, we can create dashboards and snips like this to kind of depict the KPIs that are most important to you. But there are, just to give you some example of the types of charts and graphs that we can create, there's a lot of power in these dashboards within Adaptive. I mentioned assumptions. I'll go to an assumption sheet real quick. There are some global assumptions behind the data that I've showed to this point. For example, standard raise and standard month. If you're using this to budget for merit increases that are taking place in April, you've got a global assumption here. If all of a sudden if for some reason you wanted to test out your data and instead of a 3% raise in April, you wanted to give a 4% raise in July, you can make this adjustment, save this assumption sheet, and all of the merit increases throughout your instance have now changed from April to July, and you can line those two versions up next to each other and see how that impacts. Does a 1% bump to the raise and a 3-month delay, how does that impact your full year budget? You can do that type of what if analysis quickly and easily. That is a rapid fire look at workforce planning and Adaptive. I cannot tell Tia if there are any questions, but I'm happy to answer some if there are any.
Yeah. Before we jump into the questions, do you want to share a quick slide? We have a quick
Sure.
announcement for
Yes,
um,
ma'am.
those of the group who are heading to Rising. So this year we are celebrating our 10-year anniversary, and with that, we're going to be celebrating at the Golden Gate Tap Room. It's right around this corner from the Moscone Center, which is where Rising is. So if you're going to Rising this year, it's on September 16th, and we love to have you there. So just scan the QR code to register or make a quick note in the Q&A at the end in the survey. We'll get you some information about that. But with that, we'll jump into some questions here. Our first one being, what are the key differences between workforce planning and the payroll commitment functionality within Workday?
Confession time. I am not a workday expert per se. I'm certified in financials, not HCM. I would have to defer that to an HCM person and get back to you. If you wouldn't mind including your email, I can reply with an email with an answer to that question.
All right. We also have another question for you. As employees are hired or terminated throughout the fiscal year, does the workforce planning automatically update from the HCM model, or do you know if it keeps up with the changes in the workforce population throughout the year?
That is an excellent question and something I should have mentioned. All of that data that I shared in this in the first workforce planning model that I showed, all of that comes automatically over from HCM. Like all of this data would originate in HCM, and any data point that's included in HCM, we could pull in and include in this workforce planning sheet. Now, as far as and this data can refresh as often as you need it to. What most of our clients do is they will save down snapshots of this sheet, maybe monthly, so that if this roster, excuse me, looks different from one month to the next, you can go back and you can compare your snapshots one to the other. So you can kind of keep an eye on new hire trends, termination trends, etc. If you don't save down a snapshot and Jean-Luc here retires at the end of March, when you integrate again from HCM, if Jean-Luc is no longer on your existing roster, he won't show up in your current workforce version, but he would still be shown here in last month's snapshot. So typically that's what a lot of our clients will do. They'll just every month they'll refresh this based on the data that's latest and greatest in Workday, but they will save the prior one so that they've got that history. Good question. But yeah, you don't need to update any of this manually. Of course, for planning purposes, if you know Greg Volpe is retiring in December, you can add an end date. That's a raise date, but you can add an end date to Greg Volpe, so that Adaptive will no longer budget for Greg after his retirement date. In other words, even if that isn't already included in the data that comes in from Workday, you're still able to interact with the sheet and make adjustments, if it makes for a more accurate budget.
Great. Next question we have, is this demo primarily for users with adaptive financial planning or users that will need to have a headcount / workforce planning for this level of detail?
Again, we typically create models like this for clients that are either on Workday Financials or Workday HCM, but that's not required. If you have, like, some folks have like offline spreadsheets that might look similar to a sheet like this, we can still get that loaded into Adaptive so that you can archive and report and analyze all of that data as well, whether it originates in Workday or not.
Great. And then another question we have is what is the best practice when it comes to management of positions between adaptive external application tracking systems and Workday?
Again, we can design integrations to third-party systems. It's a little more seamless when we're connecting, Workday HCM to Workday Adaptive, but it's not impossible to pull data from an external system. Or we've got some clients that take this data and export it from Adaptive into a third-party system. If they use a third-party system for reporting, we just need to leverage that in-house expertise of that third-party system, because we may not be familiar with that when it comes to the condition of the data and the format it needs to be in, for example, to take it from here to there. But we have done that. It just requires a little more cooperation with the client and their third-party system experts.
All right. Thank you, Frank. If we did not have time to answer your questions today, you can submit any additional questions in the survey that will be at the conclusion of the webinar, and we will be sure to follow up with you. Again, thank you, Frank, for presenting today. If you have any more questions about this webinar topic, feel free to leave them in the survey or reach out to your ACC or email success@intercrowd.com. Thank you all for attending and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.